Welcome to this demonstration of the password management system from Critical Path. The first example we're going to look at is creating a new password policy and showing how an administrator can change configurations for common settings such as password history, password value composition and expiration settings. Now, many organizations have several systems at any one time that require passwords for access. This can lead to a large number of password rules and confusing password format requirements. Users will tend to pick an easily remembered and therefore easily guessable password that can be reused on as many of these systems as possible, and left to their own devices will be reluctant to change these passwords as often as necessary, or will change them to very similar strings. Multiple policies will also lead to redundant or conflicting enforcement efforts which drive up the cost of administration. The benefits of moving to a centralized password policy are that it will reduce complexity and cost of managing policies. It will be easier to automatically enforce the policy, which increases security. It can ease administration and complexity, which in turn can reduce costs, and it increases security further by enforcing configurable password life and formats. In this scenario, I'm going to show you how to create a new policy, how to create general password policy settings, how to create password value settings, configuring the number of reset questions, and configuring the email settings for notifications. We start off by connecting to the Password Manager interface. This is accessed via a web browser, so you can access it from any internet-enabled computer. You don't need special client software installed. Once we've logged in, we're taken to the Password Policies folder. And from there we can go to the System Password Policy. We're going to add a new System Password Policy. To add a new System Password Policy, I click the Add button in the mainframe and then follow the directions of the Add System Password Policy wizard. The initial screen gives us an overview of what this wizard does. The next box asks us to enter a policy name and description. The next frame gives us the option to use a pre-populated configuration for defining this new policy. In this example, I'm going to use a current policy called Policy 1 as the default configuration for this new policy. Once I click Finish, I enter my password to confirm and the new policy is created. You can see that the new password policy has been added to the system password policies and that it is enabled by default. We can configure specific settings for this policy. You can also click the help icon in the top left-hand corner of the box, which will give you additional contextual information at any point of an operation. Each policy has 5 configuration settings: general details, general password, password value, reset questions, and email server details. In the General Settings tab, we can configure the description, determine whether or not passwords can be shared across the systems managed by the policy, and determine how the system reacts to changed passwords. The Systems box at the bottom has the systems configured on the platform that are available to be managed. In the General Password tab, we can configure general password settings. The values here were taken from the policy we used as our template when we created the policy. Firstly, I'm going to set password history to 10. This means that the system remembers the last 10 passwords the user has configured and doesn't allow the user to reuse any of them. The minimum password age can be set to force the user to keep their password for a certain number of days. This stops them from cycling through passwords in order to reuse an existing one again. You can configure the maximum failed attempts and lockout duration settings to configure how the system behaves when the user makes a failed attempt to change their password. Don't forget, you can easily get more information on any of these settings from the help files. The next section allows us to configure whether or not we want the user to be able to reset their own password. If this is enabled, once the user has answered a set of security questions, they can either set their password themselves, have their password emailed to them, or have the system create a new password and email that password to them. The final section on this tab allows us to configure how the system checks for expired passwords and notifies users that their passwords are about to expire. By clicking Edit, we can configure the system to search for passwords that are about to expire or have expired every 30 minutes, for example. The help file will give you more information on how the syntax works, but star means every and / means interval. So the star in hours, days of the month, etc. means every hour, every day, and the star / 30 in the minutes box means every 30 minutes. Expiration reminders allow us to configure the number of reminders sent to users before their password expires. Expiration time specifies the number of days that a password can be used before it expires. Now we move on to the Password Value tab, which allows us to specify the characters that are allowed in a user's password. Again, the help file will give you all the information you need about what is permitted in these boxes. If I click the Add button for permitted characters and click on the help, you can see the options. I'm going to select alphanumeric characters. We can also control how those characters must be specified in the next box, the Required Characters box. For example, let's assume we want to force the user to use at least one uppercase character and at least one number. So I click Add, and we can click the Help button again so that we can figure out the syntax for what we need to do. So here's our uppercase characters, and I'm going to put in a minimum number of 1. I click Add again, and you can see this numeric identifier. So I add that and say at least one character for numeric as well. I'm going to check the box that will mean the user cannot use their username as a password. And you can also specify a path to a file that contains a list of words that cannot be used as a password. I've configured the minimum and maximum size of the password. And we can specify how many of these conditions must be met before a password can be approved. As you can see here, the default value is -1, which means that all conditions must be met. Finally, for this tab, you can specify the details of any script you want to run before or after a password has been changed. When a user forgets their password, they can generate a new one or have their existing one sent to them once they've answered a number of security questions. The Reset Questions tab allows you to configure how many questions the user must create and answer before getting their password. You can also configure an amount of predefined questions that the user must set up and answer. Finally, we need to configure the email server details that will be used to email any questions or new passwords to the user. We set up the hostname, username and passwords, the from address and the attribute to use as the user's email address. We can also specify the location of specific templates for each event, which will change the text the user sees in their email. Once the required attributes have been set, click OK to commit the details. The user is required to specify their password, and once that's done, the changes are committed.